In the hush of a medieval night, when the glow of torchlight flickered across stone walls and the shadows of towering cathedrals stretched like watchful sentinels over the cobblestone streets, there existed rules of flesh that were harsher, stranger, and more unforgiving than any sword. This was a world not only bound by feudal lords and kings, but also by the invisible chains of morality, chains forged by the church, by custom, and by law. Laws that sought to govern the most private of human instincts, desire. What unfolded in the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe was not just the silent union of man and woman, but a battleground of control where sex itself became a political weapon, a divine warning, and at times, a death sentence. Imagine the cold draft of a castle keep, where confessionals whispered of sins too dark to name aloud. In this age, lust was not simply an act between bodies, it was a crime of the soul. The laws that surrounded sexuality in the Middle Ages were labyrinthine, designed to regulate who could touch whom, when, and even how. Every embrace carried the weight of heaven or hell, every kiss risked scandal, and every act outside the rigid boundaries of marriage could ignite punishments that ranged from public humiliation to the crack of the executioner's whip. The Church was the great architect of these laws. From the 11th to the 15th centuries, priests and theologians pored over manuscripts not only to define sins of the flesh, but to assign penalties that would supposedly cleanse the soul. Adultery was condemned not merely as betrayal of a spouse, but as an assault on God's design. Homosexual acts, though whispered about behind monastery walls, were publicly branded as sodomy, a word that carried with it the thunder of divine wrath. And fornication, that most common of desires between unmarried men and women, could turn into a scandal capable of ruining entire families. In the heart of villages, people lived under the watchful eyes of neighbors, bishops, and magistrates. The bedroom was not a private sanctuary but an extension of the public square. The sound of moans behind shuttered windows could be heard as evidence. A swollen belly outside of wedlock became an open confession. Inquisitors, armed not with swords but with parchment and quill, hunted sins of the body burn. Adulterers would be torn apart by demons, and those who committed unnatural acts would be damned for eternity. Yet despite the fire and brimstone, desire did not disappear. Instead, it became more dangerous, more hidden, more perverse. Consider the law of consanguinity, the Church's attempt to forbid unions between those related by blood. The restrictions reached absurd extremes. In some cases, two people could not marry if they shared a common ancestor within 7 generations. This was not only about preserving moral purity, it was a way to control alliances, inheritance, and the movement of power. Yet, desire rarely bowed to parchment, and lovers who dared to break these rules faced annulment, excommunication, or exile. The passion of two hearts could collide with the cold machinery of canon law, leaving lives shattered. Then came the question of when sex itself was permitted within marriage. Here, the rules descended into a near obsession. The Church dictated calendars of chastity. No sex on Sundays, no sex during Lent, no sex during Advent, no sex during feast days, and no sex during times of fasting. By some estimates, nearly half the year was marked as off-limits. To violate this timetable was to risk eternal damnation. Imagine a couple, newly wed, living under this crushing weight of prohibition, timing their intimacy as if it were a military campaign rather than a tender union. Desire was not theirs to claim freely. It was rationed out by holy decree. But beyond the sanctity of marriage lay the darker punishments. Adulterous women, especially, bore the brunt of public shame. While men might escape with fines or confessions, women were paraded through streets, stripped of dignity, forced to wear symbols of their sin. In some towns, a cuckolded husband could legally kill his wife and her lover if caught in the act. Others condemned the guilty to whipping, branding, or worse. The female body, in particular, was seen not as her own but as property, of her father before marriage, of her husband after. To betray that ownership was to invite fury not only from family, but from the community at large. The treatment of homosexuals in the Middle Ages reveals an even darker truth. Sodomy was a word wielded like a blade, encompassing not just same-sex relations, but any brothels, sometimes run under the very nose of the church, were deemed a necessary evil, a way to contain male lust and prevent greater sins. Cities licensed prostitutes, taxed them, and even designated districts where they could operate. Yet the women themselves were outcasts, their souls marked as stained, their fates sealed to die without honor. In death, many were buried in unconsecrated ground, their names erased, their lives remembered only as examples of what not to become. Still, their presence was vital to the machinery of society, a grim paradox where morality and economy clashed. Each law, each restriction, each punishment painted a portrait of a society obsessed with controlling desire, terrified of what might happen if flesh ruled over faith. And yet, no matter how many laws were carved into parchment or how many sermons thundered from pulpits, human nature found ways to resist. Lovers risked everything for secret meetings beneath moonlit trees. Priests broke their vows in the silence of cloisters. Nobles entertained mistresses, and kings fathered illegitimate children while condemning their subjects for lesser sins. The story of medieval sex laws is not just one of control but of contradiction, hypocrisy, and an eternal struggle between instinct and authority. As the centuries passed, these laws grew more elaborate, intertwining with politics, power, and fear. To study them is to glimpse a world where every kiss was a risk, every caress a rebellion, and every forbidden union a spark that could ignite both passion and ruin. And so, when we peel back the layers of the medieval world, past the knights and castles, past the crusades and coronations, we find a darker, quieter battlefield, the struggle over the human body itself. A battlefield where laws tried to chain the most primal force of all, desire. Then let us step deeper into the narrow streets and echoing halls of medieval Europe, where parchment and pulpit conspired to govern even the most private whispers of the flesh. For while the sweeping proclamations of the church gave the broad outlines of forbidden desire, it was in the local courts, village squares, and royal chambers that these rules took flesh. Here the strange, the tragic, and the brutal became part of daily life. In England, for example, the ecclesiastical courts, those run under the authority of the church, were crowded not only with cases both punished and trapped women, leaving them few choices in a society where chastity was their only currency of honor. In France, the Parlement of Paris recorded cases that bordered on the surreal. One story tells of a peasant woman accused of adultery. Her punishment was not death but humiliation. She was stripped down to her shift, forced to march through the village while neighbors hurled filth and insults. Her husband, publicly restored as the wronged party, was granted the right to strike her with a symbolic rod. It was not the justice of equality, but the justice of dominance, one that reminded every woman in earshot of her place. And yet the most shocking laws often involve not adultery, but the forbidden nature of certain unions. Incest, as defined by the medieval church, extended far beyond what we understand today. Cousins, distant relatives, even those bound only by spiritual kinship, such as godparents, were prohibited from marrying. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council narrowed the restrictions from 7 degrees of kinship to 4, but even this was an expansive net. Whole villages, bound together by webs of intermarriage, suddenly discovered their unions could be annulled at the whim of a bishop. The punishment for incestuous marriage was severe: separation, loss of property, and in some cases, penance as harsh as public flogging. Behind the rigid words of canon law lurked a darker reality. Love was not the ultimate measure of marriage. Bloodlines, inheritance, and alliances mattered more. There were even stranger prohibitions. The medieval world carried with it a fascination with the unnatural. Bestiality, though a crime rarely spoken of openly, was punished with merciless severity. In some towns of Germany and Switzerland, both the accused person and the unfortunate animal were executed, burned together in a grim spectacle meant to erase the act from memory. Such punishments reveal less about the frequency of these crimes and more about the paranoia of a society that saw sin lurking at every boundary between man, beast, and God. The regulation of prostitution exposes perhaps the greatest hypocrisy of medieval sex laws. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, brothels were not only tolerated, but often managed by the authorities. As those by Thomas of Chobham and others detailed a list of forbidden positions. Any act that strayed from the so-called missionary posture was condemned as sinful, unnatural, even heretical. To couple face-to-face was acceptable. To deviate was to flirt with damnation. Imagine, then, the chill in a couple's chamber as they wondered whether their union was sanctified or whether, by a single movement, they had invited the devil to their bedside. The obsession with timing went further still. Not only were holy days forbidden, but women's bodies were seen as bound to cycles of purity and impurity. To lie with a woman during her menstruation was condemned as a grave sin, one said to cause deformities in offspring or even leprosy. Sex during pregnancy was discouraged. Sex after childbirth was forbidden until a priest had blessed the woman with a purification rite. Thus, even within marriage, desire became a labyrinth of restriction, with priests holding the keys to what was lawful. And what of those who defied these laws? Some were dragged into courts, others publicly shamed. Yet many escaped into the underground of medieval life, where secret trysts unfolded in forest clearings, where troubadours sang of adulterous love, and where courtesans wielded power through their beauty and wit. The gap between official law and lived reality was wide. While the church preached abstinence and control, taverns rang with bawdy songs, and noble courts indulged in intrigues where mistresses held sway over kings. One cannot forget the story of King Philip IV of France, who used charges of sodomy and unnatural vice to destroy the powerful Knights Templar in 1307. Whether the accusations were true or fabricated, they show how sex laws were not only about morality, but about power. To accuse someone of sexual sin was to strip them of honor, to make them vulnerable, to render them unfit for trust. The Templars, burned at the stake in Paris, remind us that sex in the Middle Ages was not just a personal act, but a weapon of political annihilation. Even the lower classes were not immune from such manipulation. Village disputes could turn into accusations of adultery or fornication, wielded as tools of revenge. A neighbor wronged could whisper of midnight meetings or suspicious where entire communities gathered to witness punishment. The whispered rituals of clandestine lovers, the strange fusion of superstition and law that turned desire into a battlefield of spirits and demons. Then let us descend into the courts and marketplaces of medieval Europe, where the drama of forbidden desire played out not only in parchment decrees but in flesh and spectacle. For the Middle Ages were nothing if not theatrical in their punishments, and sex, when it transgressed, was punished in ways meant to both terrify and entertain the masses. One notorious case comes from 14th century London, where a married woman was caught in adultery. Instead of being quietly judged in private, she was placed on a wooden cart and paraded through Cheapside, the bustling market district. The crowd jeered as she was forced to wear a headdress made of rotting fish, a symbol of her corruption, while men and women alike spat at her. The humiliation was not only personal, it was communal. The punishment reminded every woman who watched that her body was not her own, that her choices were subject to scrutiny not just from her husband, but from the entire city. In some cases, trials became outright performances of terror. In France, adulterous couples could be tied together naked and whipped through the streets. In Germany, records tell of men accused of sodomy being dragged to pyres while bells tolled, their cries mingling with the hymns of the faithful as the flames devoured them. Even bestiality trials, grotesque as they were, drew crowds. The condemned man and animal, tethered together, were burned or drowned, their execution a brutal spectacle meant to erase any memory of their act through fire and water. But the underground told another story. In hidden chambers, Noblemen kept mistresses whose influence often shaped politics as much as counsel or war. Queens, too, sometimes risked secret affairs, their lovers rising and falling with fortune's wheel. And in the taverns, far from the watchful eyes of priests, laughter and lust flowed freely. There, the bawdy songs of jongleurs mocked the very laws that chained desire, turning hypocrisy into satire. These were spaces where people stole back moments of freedom, carving out brief sanctuaries of pleasure in a world that sought to deny them. Superstition intertwined with the law, and the executions. The persistence of these laws reveals a deeper truth. They were never fully successful. Human nature resisted. Priests who condemned fornication were sometimes found with mistresses or children of their own. Kings thundered against adultery, while surrounding themselves with concubines. Ordinary villagers, despite the threat of shame and punishment, continued to steal kisses in barns, to meet in the woods, to risk everything for a moment of intimacy. The history of medieval sex laws is thus not only a tale of repression but of resilience. For every law written, there was a secret act of defiance. For every public punishment, there was a hidden romance that slipped through the cracks of authority. The medieval world was haunted by its own contradictions, terrified of desire, yet unable to extinguish it. And so, when we look back across the centuries, through the smoke of burned bodies and the silence of annulled marriages, we see a society obsessed with control, but forever betrayed by the heartbeat of its people. To love in the Middle Ages was to risk shame, exile, or death, but it was also to live. For despite the weight of sermons, the thunder of law, and the fear of hell itself, desire endured. It endured in secret poems, in stolen glances, in whispered vows beneath the stars. The story of medieval sex laws, then, is not merely one of darkness, but of the unquenchable force of human passion. These laws tried to cage the most primal instinct, to tame it with punishment and prayer. Yet in the end, desire slipped through the cracks, burning as fiercely in the shadows of cathedrals as it does today. And that is the unsettling, haunting truth, that even in the most oppressive of ages, the human body remembered its own freedom.